so good to be here and such a privilege to be asked to present today, and especially with all the speakers that have gone on before me, and just the amazing people and the work that they do, and to fight for our people and to fight for our self-determination and looking at sovereignty more critically and more seriously. I just wanted to say a short prayer. Kitsamanitu kinanas kumitten, idum stay median. Kinanas kumitten kitom iwan skyan anots, kitom tapagitatamuyan. Kitom tawapatamanas kigwas tinipi, idum stay median. Kwesigas kitayan tamam tunidi taman. Tapitaman, tawapian, tayamyayan. Kwesigas kitayan, tapatitayan, chichi aigostin skata. Wichinan anots kwesta tutamag, buma, what we're going to do today. Thank you, Creator, for all that you have given me, for the miracle of living another day, for drawing breath once again, for the ability to once again see Mother Earth and water. Thank you for all that you have given me, including critical thinking skills, the ability to see, to hear, to speak, to pray, and for giving me the ability to use my hands and my feet without any compromise. Help us today to do the work that we need to do, not only today, but for as long as we need to do this work. Help us to find strength within ourselves, the resilience within ourselves, because all those gifts are within us. We just have to dig them out when we need them. And that's the glorious thing about challenges, is that we dig those out and we keep moving on, as all our people have. Thank you. Okay, COVID-19 pandemic is not only about the existence of a virus. It is much more about why this virus has succeeded in wreaking havoc despite all that scientific knowledge and research and all the Western knowledge and experience that has been collected from past pandemics. It is imperative to examine why, despite this knowledge, COVID-19 hit hard for all Canadians, especially the elderly in care homes, but harder still for First Nations living on and off reserve. First Nations were an afterthought for many, despite the lack of data and the lack of coordination between federal and provincial governments with resources and the lack of timely aid. First Nations have persevered and stepped to the forefront, as is evidenced by all that we have heard at this conference. For Indigenous people are amazing people. It is important to document the truth behind the facade that we are treated equally, but not to waste too much energy on it. As stated in, quote, being called to witness, quote, to be able to research, record, and retell truths about unsustainable fallacies is to realize the eternal hope of survival that the Indigenous peoples continue to hold across Turtle Island. Aboriginal peoples are determined to not disappear under the weight of and by the cultural, political, social, and spiritual devastation of colonial inertia. And that was from Sifi Dai. Indigenous scholars are tasked to address this crisis of knowledge by retelling the tragic consequences of the past 7 generations in a voice that resonates with resilience and pride. Close quote. Before I go any further, I wanted to share an experience I had in December 2019 when I went to British Columbia my office was asked to attend an Indigenous gender-based analysis conference. And the experience was called Being Called to Witness, which is a Coast Salish and Interior Salish Peoples of Canada tradition dating back long before contact with the European cultures. The role of a witness is to record the message of the event in their hearts and minds, and afterwards remember and validate the special occasion by carrying and sharing it with friends, neighbors, and community members. I was asked to bear witness at the end of the 3-day conference, and it always struck me how powerful that was. And I did do that with Waniskatan and paid tribute to the work that they did, and despite great odds and what they've accomplished. What I'm bearing witness to today is how the strength of a people who have retained Indigenous knowledge and teachings, tempered with natural laws, social capital, wititwin, strength, isugatsuin, resilience, resistance, blood memory, which includes land-based education, including the spirituality, ethics, accountability, and holistic thinking that is demonstrated in our languages, has the ability to withstand the ravages of COVID-19. I just wanted to tell you that I've started to speak in Cree a lot more since it was taken away, or I somehow feel I allowed it to be taken away from me in residential school. There's some shame there that I still haven't addressed, but I still make progress every day. And when my aunt calls me, she's 92, my mother's sister, she always says, neither we, encouraging me. I wanted to quote some of the powerful people that have been at this conference. Under Gender Violence and COVID panel, Diane Redsky said, medicine work we are gifted to do. And when we look at COVID in that light, it brings a different perspective to it. She acknowledged the incredible work done to raise safety nets and challenge systems that create vulnerability of our people and particularly Indigenous women, and how violence has come out with COVID, and it's particularly for Indigenous women. And as we know, we need to deal with that violence because violence and self-determination of women are on the same stage, and we need to get rid of the violence for the women to truly go leaps and bounds with self-determination. And Taylor, in that same speech, said, it shone a light on the strength of women and gave us a unique opportunity to create our own story. When I saw the land guardians, that they said our lifestyle is embedded in the land and the water. And as a young person growing up, I lived in a trapline and fish camp before I was taken away at 5. And it is those teachings and what I learned by our people walking the talk that actually saved me to be able to be where I am and to have the strength and not to have been assimilated or colonized to the extent that I couldn't challenge the system anymore. And our people are really so very good at resisting and moving forward. In the mental health break that we had with grief and loss, that one really rang true for me. And it was done by Colby Tutusis. And what he said was, the children will ask themselves, how was my mom and dad during pandemic? How did they move to problem solving? Because if we don't deal with our emotions, we stagnate. And I do. I know I do. I learned it in residential school, and just like that, my emotions are gone. We can extend that to say, how was our leadership during pandemic and how did they move to problem solving? And this conference really brought that out. He also said, what the children of our nation are experiencing today will determine who our nation becomes. How we step up to the plate and give voice to the gaps, how we step up to the plate and do positive action instead of, not just complaining and not dealing with it. And here I really was privileged to see how people have fought and come up with unique strategic ways of dealing with COVID. In the community experience panel, they talked about finding ways of navigating oppression while moving ahead. And we are always in that context. It's oppression is here and it's coming down with laws, more policies, and we're over here, making headway. Honestly, Indigenous people are so amazing. I just had wanted, there was one more. I looked at attended the Southeast Resource Development Center and how they work together as a team to come together and offer the services that were needed. And when you look at yourselves, you are all our frontline workers. And thank you for that. And it really gives me great hope. In the culture celebration, the hoop dancer said, interconnection makes us strong. We survive because everything else does. And we've understood that. We've understood that we need to take care of Mother Earth. He said, remove one thing and our earth will fall apart. And he took the hoop that was in a circle, he took one out and the thing collapsed. So it was really a good teaching for me to see. And he said, make it our own. Expand with what others have started, especially with art form. Children are so good with art and they can really grow with art. As Indigenous peoples of Canada, we continue to learn a lot about the impact history has had on ourselves, our communities, and our country. We continue to learn a lot of ourselves as business owners, as caregivers, as change agents, and about our relationship with state governments, whether they be federal, provincial, or territorial. We continue to learn about the power imbalances that exist, about our historic and ongoing struggle against land dispossession, and looking at resource extractive industries obtaining more and more power over our lands and people. That is the underlying conflict, is land and resources. And we continue to learn about human rights violation in our own homelands, identity genocide. And we continue to learn about intergenerational trauma, spiritual trauma, over-incarceration of First Nations, missing and murdered, child kidnapping through residential schools and child apprehension and the 60s scoop, and the interjurisdictional wrangling between provincial or state and federal governments, constitutional challenges, multiple chronic condition, and increasingly complex health medical histories, and living in states of different emergencies, whether it's floods or fire, resulting in community evacuation, and the list goes on. We are, in fact, not only facing the COVID-19 pandemic, but multiple pandemics, some that have lasted for centuries, slow, continuous, and insidious, but cumulative, complex, and multi-layered. And all of you have learned to work in that system and move there and tease out the parts that that you see at the moment and deal with them. So you are amazing people. Martha Cabrera from Nicaragua describes it best when she refers to her society as multiply wounded, multiply traumatized, and multiply grieving. after experiencing several decades of conflict. In Canada, addressing the problems highlighted by the COVID-19 virus will always remain inadequate if done in a siloed manner, biologically and scientifically, and without the intersectionality of the social and political determinants stated above. Without First Nations meaningful contributions, Canada will not move ahead until they deal with the relationship they have with the treaties and with Indigenous people. So we must ask, what was the landscape that welcomed this virus with open arms, allowing it to wreak havoc that it has? Canada had 10 years to prepare since the 2009 H1N1 pandemic. The Senate of Canada Committee studied this matter in 2010, and it made recommendations for the Public Health Agency of Canada, FIHAC, and the three recommendations aimed at First Nations, Métis, and Inuit was that they needed to address the social determinants of health, especially the crowded homes, the water. They needed to gather more data to direct the services and to delineate the responsibilities of the federal government for the on-reserve Indigenous population, but none of those were implemented. Why then would the pandemic situation change with COVID-19 if the landscape was left the same as it was during H1N1 in 2009 for First Nations? So they knew there was another one coming and they still did not do anything about it and then scrambled. I worked as a dentist on the reserve through the H1N1 pandemic. And while I was in one of the reserves, I went to one of the nurses as they were medevacing out a patient. And I said, "Did you swab that patient to see if it's H1N1? And she said, no, the nurses were forbidden from swabbing patients. And this came from the head office in Winnipeg. So, okay. In revisiting 2009, First Nations were hit hard during the first wave of H1N1, and there were deaths and high numbers in ICU. I remember when I came off the reserve, one of the nurses called me, and she said 80% of the patients in ICU in 2009 were Indigenous, but that was never made public. And it was intentional disregard for data collection. And we must ask ourselves why. In the 2009 pandemic, the second wave immediately followed the first wave at the end of August. And the reserves were not as hard hit as it was in the first wave. The vaccine came out in November, and FIHAC acknowledged it lessened the severity of the virus. During the COVID-19 pandemic, I provided 1 week dental care on 4 reserves over the summer of 2020, and there were no COVID cases at the time on these 4. And then unfortunately, those 4 were all hit in the second wave. In January 2021, I did a 2-week clinic in Brochet, which is my home reserve, and there were no cases at that time. And I think a case came in February. I observed that the people respected COVID guidelines, and all the people returning from outside the community had to quarantine for 2 weeks. There was a lockdown, and people coming in were screened and had to be approved for entry by the chief and council. The community had been supplied with an isolation tent, which was fully equipped and comfortable, even at minus 40-degree weather. The tent had a security guard assigned to it, and the residents had their meals prepared and dropped off, and they had shower facilities in there as well. People still hunt, fish, harvest medicine, and live off the land in Brochet. The sharing culture and the strength of a collectivity is a source of strength, and it has healing capacity. In speaking to the people at the nursing station, it was easy to see that they were still in good spirits and had the patience to outweigh the virus. I had many phone conversations with relatives because I couldn't visit them, even though I hadn't seen them for 2 years. What I noticed was their love of laughter and the humor they had. Manitoba was in a very unique position as it was the only province that was able to collect data on First Nations through a shared agreement with the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs and the Center of Policy. It was through FINISM, and Leona was responsible for that. So they did so much work, and I thank them for that. AMC also hosted many town hall meetings on Facebook to give First Nations across the province the ability to have different conversation with the pandemic response. AMC also hosted bi-weekly meetings between the pandemic response team, the Red Cross, and the 6 senators, myself included, who represent Manitoba in the Senate of Canada. This was to ensure that we could advocate for the province, for the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, in the event they needed our help. As it was, they were able to handle all the issues that came up. Sometimes too much energy is spent escaping spaces of racism, indifference, and inexcusable ignorance. But AMC was determined, and as were tribal councils, as were individual people, they were determined to be inspired to find places of good energy and draw from it. And when you do that, that energy goes out, and it's a form of prayer, the best form, I think. And our Creator sees that and says, I must go help my people. It must also be said that the measures Manitoba Chiefs have taken, guided by the strong leadership of AMC Grand Chief and Change Agent Arlen Dumas, have helped massively to suppress levels of COVID-19. We in Manitoba, alongside all Canadians, continue to wait, as we know, for the ever-changing status of vaccine availability to become reliable. And that First Nations didn't wait for the vaccine. They were just acted as fast as they could in the different ways they could, as been evidenced in this conference. One of the concerns of northern communities was the resource extractive industry of Manitoba Hydro, located in northern Manitoba. When the numbers of cases were lowered due to the efforts of the lockdown, Hydro wanted to increase their workers to 1,000 people on site. Yet, due to the concerted efforts of the Grand Chiefs and individual chiefs and individual organization, including the strategic use of blockades, Hydro had to withdraw that plan. At the same time, the premiers of Western provinces, BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, declared resource extractive companies an essential service, with sites allowed to continue to operate with 400 to 1,450 workers. Armed RCMP in Saskatchewan were dispatched to break up a sacred ceremony. It was a Sundance ceremony in May 2020. The Grand Chief ordered them off the land, stating that public health orders do not supersede First Nations laws and treaties, and added that maintaining tradition and ceremony was even more important during the COVID-19 pandemic. At the same time, there was a limit of 10 people to a gathering, and there were 35 at this ceremony. People had their temperature checked, social distancing was followed, and they were advised to self-isolate for the following 2 weeks. Minister Mark Miller, the minister responsible for Indigenous Services Canada, ISC, supported the First Nations in Saskatchewan. A prominent First Nations lawyer, Mary Turpel, who lives in BC but whose band is in Saskatchewan, advised the province to heed the constitutional right to ceremony. So our people came together to support, the people at different provinces and different communities. And Minister Miller has been one of our best supporters. Around the same time, an extractive site in northern Alberta, Keir Lake, had a coronavirus outbreak that rose to 100 cases on April 15th, 2020. And these workers were allowed to go home, taking the virus with them to BC, Saskatchewan, and Nova Scotia. At least 3 went back to the community of La Loche in Saskatchewan's remote north. More than 130 people were infected and 2 died. Only after the outbreak was declared were masks given to the workers. And during a briefing that was held for parliamentarians, I asked the government officials why extractive companies were not made responsible for the cost of the spread of the virus, including the deaths of the elders, but there was no adequate response given. In the 1974 book, The Fourth World, An Indian Reality by George Manuel and Michael Poslands, Manuel states at page 2, quote, "Within my own lifetime, I have seen my people, the Shuswap Nation, fall from a proud state of independence when we look to no man's generosity outside our own bounds, but only to our own strength and skill and the raw materials with which we had been blessed for our survival, to a condition of degeneration, servitude, and dependence as shameful as any people have ever known. I have also seen my people make the beginning of the long, hard struggle back to the plateau that is our proper place in this world." With COVID-19, I was able to see our people rise to the challenge to move out of this dependence and to co-design their strategy, and in doing so, assert their authority. And that's what you have done with all the presentations that have been done. And you are amazing people. COVID-19 has been and continues to be a good grounding experience. By that, I mean it gives me time to see the strength of our people and our allies, and to see that we continue to make it through even with all the social determinants against us. I have borne witness to a remarkable group of people as agents of change. Indigenous people play vital roles as pathfinders and mentors for me. And there are so many that I'm not even going to name people because I would be afraid to leave people out. But all of you that have attended this conference are mentors, you are change agents, and you play an extremely vital role. And we bear witness that something huge has taken place, and you can see it with this conference, when the world, we know it, has changed, and we collectively have helped to change it and steer it towards self-determination and sovereignty as a nation. Thank you. Yeah!